Okay, we convene to discuss rest of issues and what actually I like to present some of basics about for example, I consider the dilemmas of goal attainment. Actually, we can see one difficulty arise from level of a goal formation problem. So, the information required to understand the essence of a goals or the context to be developed may not be available to all scope of a public offices, for example, promoting any good, the cleanness of air, fair wages, and healthy working conditions, the nutritional value of granola, television programming that informs and entertains without corrupting, may constitute an administrative goal. However, it could be troubled in some level. A lack of information to be possible, in some sense, usual, and the followership may not be good or exploitable in the leadership context. So how do you communicate effectively by the leaders through the followers? That would be one issue. So, of course, we may talk about aspects of leadership qualities in discipline. You can see transformative leadership, for example, transactional. In some cases, we consider the charisma or charismatic leadership may be most efficient way for the improvement of organizational performance. So difficult, and information sharing is one basic to pursue. And goals also present themselves as different moral levels in some context. Consider the national security and its administration. There are many perspectives or viewpoints, opinions to be raised about its administration. Would it be proper to involve in Iraqi war? How do we progress on new Cold War, for example, between Russia and United States, now contended involving the Ukraine crisis. So in some cases, we may consider the humanistic cause about the a Syria event. How do you see so sadly the dying children affected by fatal chemicals? That is it permissible? We do not agree, and many interests and grounds may complicate the goals of a national government, for example. And I also like to introduce the context of bureaucratic pathologies. The psychological reality of frontlines human service agency or school or police department is that it contains high levels of stress. Such stress is one example of a bureaucratic pathology. Charles Gusser's description of that reaction to stress in an County Welfare Agency illustrates the problem. What could you see? The concept of compression refers to the stress of heat faced by service delivery workers. The manifestations of such stress are now being widely discussed around the country under the rubric of a burnout. In the department, studied perhaps a fifth of the workers exhibited symptoms associated with this syndrome, such as disillusionment, weariness, a frustration, and demoralization. When the subject of personal stress was explored in interviews with workers, several factors surfaced. One universally identified by respondents is the activity known pejoratively as paperwork. The completion of forms, the preparation of reports, and the arrangement for documentation involve an enormous amount of tedious clerical work, taking half of or more of the workers on duty time. The second origin of stress is clearly related, namely escalating caseloads. So one scholar also pointed out the concept, the viewpoint in terms of a bureaucratic maze. Who coined the term? It's actually the modern bureaucracy, as discussed in the last class, plays an important role to address social justice. We have some byproduct, bureaucratic pathologies or bureaucratic maze. In custom and practices, they would be actually governing and might be entrenched to be redressed only partially. Well, either eradication could not be embraced, actually. And I also introduce the three basic types of a federal administrative agencies. In the last class, we talk about the government of the United States in structure, constitutional structure. So. And we have many names and institutions. A Federal Trade Commission, FTC. What does it mean? OSHA in the Department of Labor. It is a cabinet level agency. And we can illustrate an example, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. In this concern, you have three basic types of federal administrative agencies. The first type would be an independent regulatory commissions. So they are expected to play a quasi-judicial role. So they adjudicate and also makes a rule and dispose issues specifically. And the element to be attributed this agency is the concept of independence. So they are expected to execute their responsibility rather independently from line authority of executive branches. And they also act in collective fashion of organs. So often the experts and experienced officials constitute the commission. So they discuss a review and made a resolution about issue and agendas. In some cases, you may find type of legislative codes we often call Article 1 code in comparison with Article 3 code. Constitutional dealing could be made distinct in between two organs of judicial nature. And the second type of federal administrative agencies would be agencies housed within a cabinet-level department. So, as illustrated, OSHA would be agencies housed within a Department of Labor. And lastly, we have agencies outside the formal structure of a cabinet department. EPA would pertain to this type. And we now arrive at the stage which drives us to set the stage for the study of administrative law. So we have opened the immense terrain in week 1 and week 2, but we do not want to lose sight of administrative law's big picture. So we conclude this understanding by returning its beginning. We need administrative law to check regulatory government. It is a basic tenet of our political theory that things can happen when government operations are hidden from public scrutiny. In March 1998, the files of a public agency in the state of Mississippi, as we have surfaced in the last class, were open to the public for the first time. So we find a scope of imperfections as well as others are all embedded in a deeper political and legal structure that you will increasingly come to know as you progress through the class. And agencies exist because, for a variety of reasons, legislatures delegate powers to administrative bodies for the purpose of creating and enforcing specific policies. However, if they choose to, politicians can retain considerable influence in the bureaucratic process. So it would not be inaccurate to conceive the agencies are legally accountable as a matter of a judicial control and others, and could, in many aspects, politically responsible to the constitutions, and as well as in a negotiating context to the Congress. So the organic statute, for example, about the Korean government, reveals the kind of interrelationship between governmental branches and sections of Congress, for example. So we have a scope of a congressional committees to be related in responsibilities and the scope of a public powers with branches of government, departments. And then we begin to think about the theme. What is law? Since the constitutional government is grounded on the rule of law ideas, it is a first priority to understand and identify accurately the law. What is law? The explanation would not be extensive, since there would be a theme to be dealt in other class, jurisprudence, legal philosophy. In the context of administrative law, you're now given four groups in classification. First, we see statute. That is the law to be respected in terms of rule of law. State legislature and the Congress of the United States pass laws after gathering information, debating the meaning of the evidence and the wording of the bill, and in most cases, after compromising a differing political interest in the final product. A statute is simply a law established by an act of legislature. Statute may address social conditions and problems, for example, the threat of business monopoly, the need to prevent a fraudulent advertising, or the desire to create and fund an agency charged with giving emergency assistance to people whose homes and livelihoods have been wiped out by natural disasters, and so on. So I have accepted one picture, which discloses the disaster of Hurricane Katrina that occurred in years ago. How do you consider? Actually, we are talking about a modern administrative state, and it would be an emergent or a responsive state against natural disaster. In Orient, we consider the kind of a natural catastrophe or disaster in a very divine way. So the God or heaven may punish the king. So we now have to expel the king or monarch. He was betrayed by the justice or God. That should not be the case in this modern administrative state. Science, information would give the status of our reality. So, the statutes speak for the future, because legislators cannot tell precisely what shape the problem will take in the future, or predict what new methods of monopolizing trade or what new consumer fraud schemes people will dream up. Statute must address the future in language that's general and flexible enough to be adapted to new conditions. Since general and flexible statutory language cannot resolve specific cases, the cause exists to interpret the meaning of statutes when they are applied to human activities. So we may have a need to sift and winnow the characteristics of a public statute. Is it directly mandated about human activities, or just organic to structure the ways of interplay and scope of powers conferred within a specific branch. So the concept could be substantive and also a standard, a procedural in some cases. And also some public statute may be purely internal about the process of House or Senate or agencies. And as we know, the statute about private laws would often be small in number. So the scope also will be narrowed to complement with case laws. A serious public problem or the need to address challenges would incur the need to enact the statute. For example, what is liquor statute? Rate of a traffic accident, maybe from juvenile person, others. So some modification about traditional tort law would be publicly required and mobilize a consensus to address the specificity of a state or others. In some cases, may be responded with a federal laws or others. You will learn the United States is common law country. However, the statute would often prevail if the scope of subject matter may overlap. Of course, there would an ample chances to interpret carefully on distinguishing and others. So how to apply the statute to the case would ultimately fall within the assertive code. However, theoretically, the statute often regarded to prevail. Then, what is other source of law in United States? Common law would be governing, as you suppose. In the Old English legal system, judges decided conflicts between citizens without the benefit of statute. If someone damaged your water wheel by banging it with his boat, if someone agreed to buy your cow, then broke a promise, if 3 of your pigs wandered into a neighbor's field and it refused to return them, your only legal recourse would be to ask a judge to resolve the conflict. No formal written body of law governed the judge's decision. But as time went on, the judicial decisions themselves came to constitute a body of a precedent to which other judges would refer in deciding similar cases that came before the authority a judge needed to decide a particular case. The aggregation of such rules and principles eventually constitute common law of a variety of discrete legal spheres, such as tort, contracts, property, and so on. And also, I like to make a remark about context of public policy. You see, we have a separate path of evaluation between the Court of Chancery and Court of Equity, or common law code, you consider. That could be considered in terms of what attributes of 2 branches, public agencies and judiciary. The Court of Chancery represents the ultimate conscience of monarch, sovereign being in feudal context, you consider. So it's equivalent of state in this modern term. we consider the popular sovereignty would originate from the United States. In any case, we consider the public superiority against private laws. Often we apprehend with the primacy of a private terms in democratic society. Still, we may be instilled by its very law about the context of a fair trade commission. Actually, what is a freedom of contract? It is a pillar to sustain the capitals or enterprises. They have to purchase resources to produce. They have to conclude a labor agreement to mobilize the workforce necessary in production. So it is a basis of a capitalistic development, you see. A crucial institution in substitute of a feudal status. So you may come across the maxim commanded by Maine. So the capitalist society could be said the transfer of a status-based society to the contract-based society. How do you consider? Nonetheless, the Court of Chancery is very powerful to intervene in the contract. How do you see proper and appropriate about intervention of public authority into private contract? Notably, you see the contract clause was enshrined in the United States Constitution, which inhibits the abridgment of a private contract. So it is basic and sacred, achieved by a democratic revolution. It is actually a campaign or a foundational ethos to preserve a contractual freedom. However, the Court of Chancery may alter the freedom contract, freely concluded theoretically between two parties. That concept could resurrect as related with the modern Federal Trade Commission. How do you agree? So today in the United States, if your dog gets loose and digs up the prize-winning flowers in your neighbor's garden, or if you agree to perform a service for someone and then break your promise, or if you keep a package of valuable silver delivered to your home by mistake, a judge will determine your legal responsibility. So the modern judicial branch is very judicious and also technical in reflection of historical past, and which could provide a good point of comparison with the Court of Chancery. Then the Court of Chancery may now survive as a kind of, but remains in a limited scope, modern times, and the laws of Court Chancery may be transferred in modern terms to the administrative branch, I consider. And also that legal history would be a burden to even to trace to the times of a conqueror, William in 11th centuries. And what is the per curiam? Is it Congress or executive branch, or is cabinet? How do you see the Star Chamber, whose organ is very oppressive and execute the dual roles in modern perspective about judicial and administrable? So we see the King's Code. That is not a judiciary in a detail, you see. So the mixture of institutional strands could be traced in the wake of history, common law history. Unless a statute clearly indicates what the outcome should be, the judge's decision will often be based on common law principles that resemble the judge-made law that prevailed in England centuries ago. This is also sometimes referred to as a case law, as distinguished from a statute law. Statutes are especially important in administrative law because agencies are created by statute and derive their powers from legislature. Common law or case law nevertheless has special significance for purposes because it rests on the questionable assumption the judges decide cases correctly, even in the absence of clear direction from the legislature. And in understanding the law of the United States, and typically in the context of public policy, the Constitution is tremendously important. Its ultimate authority to create the base of government branch, and also should be respected in any seriousness as a public officer and governmental branch. Constitutions state the underlying rules for the operation of political system. They create and govern government. When it became clear that the original Articles of Confederation did not establish an effective form of government, the representatives from the colonies met in Philadelphia to create new constitution. Gatherings of political leaders in the territories similarly drafted constitutions as these territories sought admission to the Union. Legislature update constitutions by amendment. In some states, this process is almost as simple as legislating. In the case of national government, however, amendments must win approval from the Senate, the House of Representatives, and 3/4 of the states before they become part of the Constitution. Constitutional provisions also regulate the citizenry directory. This occurred with the Prohibition Amendment and amendments to state constitutions to so more often. However, the bulk of a constitutional law clearly defines not what citizens can and cannot do, but what powers the government may or may not exercise. The first 3 articles of the United States Constitution, for example, prescribe a general structure for the 3 branches of government. They also detail some of the powers those branches may exercise. Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states, or the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. You may already discern that if we care about limiting the power of bureaucratic government, and if the Constitution is the law that governs the government, then the Constitution must play a central role in administrative law. And in this class purpose, we are happy to see the regulatory law, and it is law created by public agencies and rule-making power see in the context. Congress makes statute. Judges create common law, constitutional conventions, and the amendment process develop constitutions. The fourth and final kind of law takes an interesting twist. Administrative law agencies also make law. The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, this is an important organ to respond with a technical advancement of internet and new devices about public communication and others, and also may collaborate with the USTR, United States Trade Representatives, to protect the commercial interests of the United States. So actually, now interdependency in terms of international trade and economy is very significant, as you consider. Korea would collapse if we remain honorable solitude from the international community in terms of economy. So it would arise as kind of a economic war, very serious. And we have held the negotiations about the conclusion of a free trade agreement between Korea and the United States. And in some cases, the negotiation may get into tougher phase to forge the economic might of others. And also, USTL is a very efficient administration. Very powerful to be responsible directly to the president, and statutory delegated to execute the very emergent powers. Super 301, have you heard of that provision? It's notorious in international trade context. So they would be given a quota as mandatory to investigate the unfair practices or illegal practices against the trade interest of the United States, and they are empowered and responsible to initiate the negotiation about correction and compensation. In some cases, explore the sanctionary measure to bring the case to WTO, and bilateral negotiation would be shaped to demand the correction. So Federal Communication may collaborate with USTR and of course should be engaged in many areas of public concern. The scope of responsibility would rather extensive. And it limits the number of commercial broadcasting stations a company may own. The Internal Revenue Service, abbreviated as IRS, by rule decides which groups qualify as charities and therefore need not pay taxes. The IRS creates a tax law. The Federal Drug Administration decides whether to classify red yeast rice as a drug, a designation that makes it legally available only by prescription. These laws regulate citizens. So do environmental law, antitrust law, and consumer protection law. Books have been written about each one of these fields of substantive law made by bureaucrats. Administrative law, on the other hand, governs the bureaucrats themselves. It focuses on matters of procedural law, in contrast to substantive law. Yet, as we noted above, these two kinds of law may affect each other in important ways over time. So the basic idea, to orient yourself through the class, will be concerned of rule of law. So the evils to be addressed will lie in arbitrariness of a public administration. How do we shape the paradigm of social justice in that specific area? That is an essential question and puzzles agonizing the public officers. They have to possess adequate knowledge and expertise, and of course should well be versed with the constitutions, case laws, common laws, to execute their responsibility. Then I also present some basics about Administrative Procedure Act. What is adjudication? So actually a hearing and public forum should be afforded properly. And also how do you consider the rule making? Before advancement of that brief, I like to discuss Theme 5. How do we perceive the ethics of the rule of law in bureaucratic government? The author in this theme describes very persuasively about the rule of law dynamism. The author point in first-hand stress says constitutions are the supreme law in the United States. The rule of law, therefore, requires courts to follow the Constitution. And second, the rule of law requires judges to enforce statutes as written. So it is not the work or job of a public officer to violate the plain language of statute. That is one of greatest fallacy in executing their responsibilities. That patent transgression would well merit the rejection, denial of a code. Some legislative language is concrete and clear, but very often it is no less general or ambiguous than the language of Constitution. In fact, a statutory imprecision pops up particularly often in administrative law, for the simple reason that if Congress would make clear law on a subject, it would not need to create a regulator body in the first place. So the phrase full bearing is not much clearer than due process. In such circumstances, judges are just as free under statutes as they are under constitutions to draw on their personal biases. So for both parties to carry a suit forward, for example, they must be able to predict or strongly believe that the law in question is uncertain enough to take a shot at winning their claims. So often the public statute is very amenable to many possibilities of interpretation. The discretion of public administration would tend many ways to increase public good at its maximum extent. So their wisdom and also expertise, the scientific knowledge obtained through the practices and a public forum would serve. So actually the matter is not judicial in many aspects. The prevailing concern would have a focus on the fatal fallacy of a discretion. Often the court would differ. You consider in Chevron case, which is very principled, the fact the area of law, and it is basic to abide by the express language. And what is said, the rule of law requires judges to follow precedents. This more limited formulation of the rule of law recognizes that judges simply draw on their biases in deciding cases otherwise. The restraint of law arises merely in the obligation to follow these decisions in future similar cases. And the trouble here is that, as you saw, we have not actually we're incomplete about 3 illustrations. We will revisit. You will see the context in Matthew's treatment of Goldberg. In that case, judges are free to say a case. It's factually different from a previous case and hence escape the restraining influence of prior law. So Goldberg eventually succeeded on his case. So he is a social welfare beneficiary and argued his case in the courtroom about divestment of his entitlement without due process. The court accepted his argument. However, in Matthew's case, the court distinguished on the basis of fact and also the common law judges, principal task of common law judges would be to distinguish the case in subtlety, which should be in subtlety and about fact and logic or metaphor. That is technical, and also the stare decisis is in principle to bind binds judges to follow precedents. So that is a strength to develop the common laws, and they would eventually be articulated in terms of restatement, or how do you consider the accomplishment WTO achieved. So they begin with case law and may be concluded in any principles or with that. However, they did not perceive and still do not perceive the case law as the restatement as a binding norm. It's just restatement, which is very influential actually in understanding U.S. law. Perplexing, may be yours. However, the restatement may guide for the provide a guide and useful insights for civil law students. So, how do you prefer to see restatement other than difficult and intricacies of common law? And the rule of law in force refers to a philosophy of justice, not a concept of following the law. So, if we seek a test of judicial impartiality but cannot find it in the black and white letters of society's rule, a philosophy of justice may offer the only alternative. But which philosophy should judges choose? Should they attempt to articulate a prevailing social customs, Marxism, natural law theory? We are on the right track, but have yet to get on the proper philosophical track. And in fifth, the rule of law is a philosophy of compromising and balancing among social interests. This statement pinpoints a common political as well as judicial approach to constitutional and administrative law problems. The Supreme Court selected this very test in its decision in Matthew. It said the cost in Goldberg of denying a hearing were greater than in Matthews because Eldridge could get the payments while he waited, but Kelly could not. Many administrable cases used language of balancing interests because it conveys some idea of weighing interest and producing a fair outcome. But the balancing test usually leaves judges free to define the balance any way they wish. And the public interest almost always outweighs one individual person's problem. To be sure, not all disabled recipients depend on the checks, but most do. And Eldridge certainly did. Being deprived of hearing may be less costly to him than it was to Kelly, but is the difference enough to justify the court's decision against him? Balancing will play a part in the judicial administrative law role, but it does not fully satisfy the obligation to the rule of law. So, what does it mean, adjudication or adjudicate? It entails pivotally the concept of balancing. So, proportionality, about justice. Of course, it should be defined clearly, as you see the rejection of natural theory in the United States Supreme Court. And also, the court, in some cases, may exercise other dimension of constitutional review. For example, strict scrutiny about racial discrimination. In that case, a more compelling and important state interest should be presented to support the state action. So higher level of a standard required in dealing with a constitutional mandate about equal protection of law. Discrimination often be condemned if the Supreme Court justice classed in that category, the issue involved. In sixth, the rule of law seeks to achieve fairness, rationality, and social equality by promising public participation in decision making. So as I said, the APA guides in three folds: information, participation, and accountability. And in seventh, the rule of law checks and shapes the power of government by seeking the maximum feasible reduction of arbitrariness. So reduction of arbitrariness should be priority in executing their duty. And also uncertainty reduction would be essentially desired, since now the government executive branch is very important to ensure predictability and legal stability. So the rule-making power within the administrative branch now say so much to come to the end point of policy address. So often the policy citizens or others are sensitive about administrative action, and their interest would highly depend on the discretion of administrative branch. So we are left with 3 illustrations about due process. And as commented earlier, this position of administrative appeals in the United States Court of Appeals would be seen statistically very stark of his time sequence. You see, in 1945, as less cases in number, 566. However, in 2005, you see total cases disposed by U.S. Court of Appeals would amount to 10,960. And the cases disposed without hearing would be numbered at 1,405 in 1995, 185 in 1945. So it indirectly denotes the increasing role of administrative state. Also, you will be available about the U.S. map, which shows number and composition of federal judicial circuits. So, what are those? Okay, then that will be all for this class, and we'll continue on the rest of class discussion next class, and also some time to think about the questions related with the class discussion, and we'll advance to the next chapter, the constitutional authorities about administrative state. Okay, thank you for your attention. See you in the next class.